So Teddy, I don't know where oh, you did. Excuse me.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I want to say welcome to the docents who this is a wonderful in-service for, and I want to welcome members and just other people who are part of the Folger family. Today's really special. This is an exclusive lecture by Stephen Grant, who will be showing us 60 additional images, yes, from that did not make it into his book on the Folgers collecting Shakespeare. This really fantastic presentation you're about to see was made possible by Nicole Winard. She is the docent in-service coordinator for our fantastic docent corps, and without her, we wouldn't have been able to have this wonderful opportunity. So I'd really like to say thank you to her. So Stephen Grant is the author of the biography of Mr. and Mrs. Folger, published in 2014 by Johns Hopkins University Press. The volume contains 34 illustrations. And today he will be speaking on the topic of the images that did not get into collecting Shakespeare, the story of Henry and Emily Folger, followed by a 30-minute Q&A. And then after the Q&A, Stephen will be available to sign books over at the main entrance of the exhibition hall. And you could purchase one of the books in our gift shop. So without further ado, Stephen Grant.
Thank you, Kate. I've always maintained that the docents are my favorite audience because what I say on a Friday, I'm quite confident they will be saying sometime the following week to the visitors to the Folger. Docents, you are the front lines, explaining the Folger Library, treasures, and its founders, 6 days a week. This is my 81st talk about the Folgers in the UK and the US since the book came out on the auspicious day of the Ides of March in 2014. I hope that this in-service session will be most useful. Before, I would like to recognize 3 lovely ladies. First, Marie Frances Hardison, who I interviewed for the book, whose husband, O.B. Hardison, was the 4th director of the Folger, 1969 to 1983. Letitia Yendel, former curator of manuscripts at the Folger and author of the Finding Guide of the Folger's personal papers. And Abigail Weavenson, to whom collecting Shakespeare is dedicated. When I pick up a book in a bookstore, after checking on who the publisher is, I don't read the blurbs, I look for the illustrations. I went through my collection of 80 images relating to the Folgers that I had assembled. This was in May of 2011, warned by my literary agent that no academic publisher would pay for anywhere near that number. When Johns Hopkins agreed to publish my book, I painfully whittled the number down to 55 to propose to them. Johns Hopkins said I would get 20 half-tones. Half-tones mean that the photos are printed on paper stock, not on glossies. I went to Gail Pastor, Folger director, to report that I was dismayed about the paucity of illustrations. She said on the spot that the library also was distraught and could help out. She found funds and had a stipend sent to the publisher, which covered 14 more images. This is why you see, as Kate indicated 34 illustrations in the book. Lucky author, lucky reader. Now it is 5 years since I submitted the final manuscript, and I thought docents and others would be interested to see images that did not make the cut. This is the theme I have chosen for today's talk. Let's see what we might learn from the unaccepted images. Any idea who this is? To discover the photo on the left, I took a ferry from Hyannis to Nantucket in my home state of Massachusetts, where the image was waiting for me at the Nantucket Historical Association Library. The serious, blue-eyed, 16-year-old Henry Clay Folger, Sr., founder of the library, was about to leave Nantucket Island in 1849 due to the collapse of the whaling trade. He returned to Nantucket only once for his 2-week honeymoon in 1856. On the right, Henry Sr. was adored in the family for his horseshoe mustache and musical talents. He was a businessman whose fortunes went up and down. After the Panic of 1873, he found himself with only 75 cents in his pocket, according to the autobiographical essay he wrote. To obtain this photo in 2010, I drove to Fredericksburg, Virginia, where a Folger grandniece had covered her dining room table with photographs, documents, and artifacts about the Henry Folgers. She was a namesake. Born in 1931, she remembers her great aunt Emily. Any idea who this might be? I located this portrait at the California Historical Society in San Francisco. 2 years younger than brother Henry Folger Sr., James A. Folger, 1835 to 1889, sailed from Nantucket to San Francisco in 1850 to look for gold. He found some, but more importantly, he learned that the coffee that gold miners were drinking was insipid. He helped build a coffee mill in San Francisco and sold the coffee initially to gold diggers. In 1860, he founded J.A. Folger Coffee Company. One day, while visiting my son in San Francisco, around the corner from his office, I happened upon this sign outside 101 Howard Street. Folger Coffee was the first Folger fortune in the U.S. The heir was Abigail Folger, who lost her life in the Charles Manson slayings of August 9th, 1969. 101 Howard is now an optometrist shop. Pictured behind me is the original J.A. Folger safe, which I learned from Abigail Folger's younger brother, Peter Folger, was installed in 1905. An early picture of Henry Jr. with his mother. Eliza Jane Clark, called Lida, was a grade school teacher living in New York City until she married Henry Clay Folger Sr. Emily recalled her mother-in-law as an unassuming presence, yet a person who would take charge organizing picnics on Coney Island. Lida Clark Folger passed on to Henry her mathematical acumen and organizational skills. Emily's father, Edward Jordan, campaigned for Abraham Lincoln. who gave him a commission as solicitor at the Treasury Department. During the Civil War, the Jordans lived on the corner of 12th and M Streets. Jordan took Emily to meet President Lincoln in the Executive Mansion. During his legal career, Edward Jordan corroborated the identification of John Wilkes Booth's riding boots shortly after Lincoln's assassination. Emily's mother, Augusta Ricker Jordan, inspired in her 3 daughters, who all went to Vassar College, an enlightened mind, a sense of humor, and a critical love of books. The first professor hired by beer brewer Matthew Vassar in 1865 was Maria Mitchell. And no, she is not in drag. She was brought up a Quaker in Nantucket. She was Henry Folger's cousin. She was the first American female professional astronomer. A comet she discovered in 1847 is named after her. All 3 Jordan sisters took astronomy at Vassar with this grande dame. When she died, Emily organized alums to contribute to an endowment in her honor. Observe the dress of the Vassar students during their compulsory outdoor physical exercise. Here they are playing croquet. Perhaps difficult to make out is the eminence noire in the lower left. That is Miss Mitchell herself hovering over her dominion. Maria reigned over the 3rd largest telescope in the country. The last 3 slides were provided by the Vassar Library Special Collections. This one shows a student dormitory in 1878. While Emily is not one of the 2 students, she lived nearby in Main Hall. Observe the dark decor, the furniture, the wall decorations, the gas lighting. The sun is not allowed to enter. Charles Pratt Sr. was an enormously important person for Henry, his boss, his benefactor, and character model. He was the largest refiner of kerosene in the country in 1869. In 1872, John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil Company bought him out in a secret deal. Pratt was the founder of Pratt Institute and a philanthropist. I purchased this photo at the Brooklyn Historical Society. Charles Millard Pratt on the left was Henry Folger's roommate at Amherst College, a director of Standard Oil of New Jersey, vice president of Standard Oil of Kentucky, trustee of Amherst College and Vassar College. On the right, Herbert L. Pratt, youngest son in the family, close friend known as Bert, followed in Henry's footsteps as president and then board chair of Standard Oil Company of New York, Succonie. The Pratts lived in Brooklyn and summered in Glen Cove on the north shore of Long Island. Amherst College Special Collections provided me with these images. Docents, you remember reading, collecting Shakespeare, that Folger collected other items than Shakespeareana. All of his golf books went to Bert. Charlie was the recipient of 1,400 books on Lepidoptera, his wife's passion. I've seen them in the Amherst College Special Collections. A letter from Henry to a bookseller. Bernard Quaritch, 11 Grafton Street, New Bond Street, West London, England. Gentlemen, I wrote you recently seeking some postcard photographs of the Roubilliac statue of Shakespeare, which I thought was in the British Museum. You answered that there was no such statue there, yet I hesitate to let the matter rest, because I am very sure that I have seen, near the entrance to the British Museum, in the main hall, the figure leaning on a pedestal with books on it, the statue having been made by Roubilliac. If this is so, the museum undoubtedly has postal cards picturing this statue. And if they have, may I trouble you to get a dozen of them for me? Very truly yours, Henry Folger. Curiously, the letter is not dated. It is not signed because this was a carbon copy, and Folger used the services of her Standard Oil personal assistant, Alexander Welch, to type his boss's business correspondence. Business meant not only petroleum, but also Shakespeare. There is the statue by Roubilliac in question. Bill Sherman, head of research at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, wrote me in 2015. The Roubilliac statue is still on display in our sculpture gardens. Bill curated an exhibition at the Folger on Decoding the Renaissance, 500 Years of Codes and Ciphers in 2014 and 15, as some of you remember. This man did not know what an iPhone was. On page 183 of Collecting Shakespeare, I write that 4 local photographers vied to take picture postcard photos of the Folger. Primarily was this man, Polish-born Theodore Hordzak, lying on the ground with his 10-pound gold Ansco camera that used 8 by 10-inch negatives. The others were William M. Ritase, Samuel H. Gotcho, and the news photography firm Underwood and Underwood. I purchased this photo from the Library of Congress, which holds the complete Hordzak photo collection. This postcard, produced by the Meriden Gravure Company, Meriden, Connecticut, is entitled 2nd Street Facade, Fountain and Figure of Puck by Brenda Putnam, photo Hordzak. On the back of the card, which I purchased on eBay, is the message sent to Bellevue, Pennsylvania, postmarked in 1935. Certainly wish you could see this place. We'll tell you about it in a letter that follows. Too bad I never found the letter. Docents, when you show the original marble or the aluminum copy of Puck to visitors, you might tell the stories about Puck's marble thumbs being regularly snapped off, and about the day the model for Puck at the entrance to this theater showed up at the Folger front door and introduced himself as Peter Gazzola of Rye, New York. Both incidents are told on page 200. I read from a letter sent on November 19th, 1929 from Alexander Trowbridge to Paul Philippe Cray. Dr. Putnam's daughter, Brenda Putnam, is an accomplished sculptor and has done excellent work. I wonder what you would think of the idea of inviting her to do the figure on the fountain. it would be a most gracious gesture if this suggestion should be accepted by Mr. F, and the invitation should come directly from him to Brenda Putnam. I believe she is qualified to do this. Brenda's father, on the right, the longest-serving Librarian of Congress, Herbert Putnam, 1899 to 1939, facilitated passage of legislation allowing the Folgers to acquire Grant's Row. Grant's Row, Grant is no relation to me, of 14 row houses for the Folger Library. The land secretly acquired by the Folgers had been slated for a Library of Congress annex. After her husband died, Emily turned to Putnam for trusted advice on decision-making concerning operations during the library's early years. Both photos from the Library of Congress. On the left is Alexander B. Trowbridge, consulting architect for the Folger. Not knowing Craig, but an old acquaintance of Trowbridge, Folger preferred the system of a buffer between architect and client. It suited him well. The Library of Congress chose Trowbridge to be the consulting architect for its annex, right next to the Folger, now the Adams Building. After looking widely, I finally found this photo in the Century Association Archive Foundation in New York City. Folger never got used to the strong French accent of architect Paul-Philippe Craig. On the right, born in Lyon. It was quite a tribute to the Frenchman to have designed 3 major buildings on or near the mall, with the Pan American Union in 1910, the Federal Reserve in 1937. Craig wrote a beautiful homage to Folger as a client. Quote, "No one knows better than an architect how many projects have been ruined by the client's insistence upon additions or changes utterly out of harmony with the plan as a whole. But Mr. Folger was entirely lacking in the petty vanity that prompts such blind and destructive willfulness. He was able to grasp the architect's purposes and ready to allow them to be developed under the unity of direction which is essential to the production of any artistic work worthwhile." This photo is from the University of Pennsylvania Rare Book and Manuscript Library in Philadelphia. On December 16, 1916, an oil tanker honoring H.C. Folger was launched from Pier 70 in San Francisco. It was commissioned and owned by the Atlantic Refining Company of Philadelphia, of which Folger had been president before the 1911 breakup of Standard Oil. It weighed 10,000 tons and transported 100,000 barrels of oil products to customers and troops in Europe during the First World War. Did Folger travel to California for the launch of the oil tanker named after him, as one might expect? Not a chance. That day, he was in New York filling out an application for a bank loan to buy more Shakespeare. Once a German torpedo missed the Folger by 50 yards. I obtained these photos from the San Francisco Maritime National Historic Park. we see the SS H.C. Folger in dry dock and on the open water. Portrait painter Frank O. Salisbury and his wife on a transatlantic steamer. Salisbury, who completed the oil portraits of both Henry and Emily, which are in the reading room, wrote Emily on November 21st, 1932, after the Folger opened. We have just returned from Washington, where we have been to see the Folger Shakespeare Library. And although Mr. Folger and you showed me the plans and I was able to build it in my imagination, yet in reality the actual thing has far surpassed my best imaginative dream. The whole structure is perfectly wonderful. I should like to congratulate you most heartily for the realization of yours and Mr. Folger's magnificent conception. It is truly a great heritage to mankind, and it will forever shed its supreme influence of culture and refinement upon all who look upon its structural beauty and study its exhibited treasures. On the left is a flyer of the Homestead Resort during its 250th anniversary in 2016. The resort in Hot Springs, Virginia, the Folgers chose for their annual vacation from 1914 until 1929. Emily returned as a widow. On the right, you see the homestead stationery Henry used to write one of the most significant letters of his life. February 11, 1918. Dear Mr. McCreary, who was a real estate agent in Washington, I would like to get you to run over and look at the properties marked 1, 2, 3, and 4 on accompanying diagram. Inquire very cautiously about the 4 properties on Capitol Hill that I have marked on the accompanying diagram and see if they can be bought. A postcard I acquired on eBay depicts the old bathhouse at the homestead. Guests taking the baths had to walk from their hotel rooms to the baths through long serpentine corridors. To complete this promenade with grace and dignity, ladies adapted the habit of dressing up, often in trimmed chiffons and elaborately embroidered silks. Emily Folger's bath costume was unique. She donned the purple robe Julia Marlowe wore as Portia in The Merchant of Venice. The photo was taken in the founder's room of this library. On the right is Folger in a putting stance, the image I chose as the first in the book. On the left, you might be able to make out that I am holding a vintage hickory putter, borrowed from the Homestead historian. I struck the Folger pose for my first talk at the Homestead during that anniversary year. In the picture, I'm wearing the Shakespeare insult tie that I bought at the Folger gift shop, the one that I have on today. If you look up close, it says things like, "Thou hast more hair than wit." Occasionally, Henry Folger was depicted in cartoons. In this one that Emily saved, Henry is shown in his familiar putting pose, along with a British Lieutenant Colonel W.B. Dupre. The putter that Henry used was one that one uses the way one would address a croquet ball. One holds the putter between one's legs. This particular putter has been outlawed for many decades. I believe it was outlawed by Bobby Jones. I was invited to spend a long weekend at the homestead and give a Folger talk. The homestead historian and golf pro both spoke during the Q&A. For our lodging, we were given the Folger's old room. This weekend was one of my biggest thrills as a biographer. You can listen to the talk that I gave there by clicking on the link on the homepage of my website, to be divulged a little later. I knocked at the door of the director's office at the Nassau Country Club in Glen Cove, Long Island, one day. I explained my Folger research project to him. He thought a minute and said, "I might have something that will interest you." After a few minutes, he came up from the basement storeroom and produced a copper cup and a dust cloth to clean it off. I read, Nassau Country Club, September 1903, won by H.C. Folger. Folger played golf at the homestead in Glen Cove and when invited to by John D. Rockefeller. Customarily, the two Standard Oil executives played Mondays at 10 o'clock. This is the only house the Folgers ever owned, situated on 2 acres across from the Nassau Country Club in Glen Cove. The address is, appropriately for a golfer, 11 St. Andrews Lane. It was the Folger residence from 1928 to 1936. Recently, it has been expanded into a 10-room residence. The present homeowner showed me around. She also came to my talk at the Glen Cove Library and made comments about how the garden had changed since the Folgers' days there. The Folger dining room, with its period wallpaper, contained a silver safe. A fake door to the kitchen hid a safe. Don't you imagine that the Folgers hid first folios there as well as their silver? In the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust Library in Stratford-upon-Avon, I asked to see the guest books that visitors signed when they came to see the Holy Trinity Church. In the 1905 guest book, I found Henry's name above Emily's. The couple made 11 trips to England. Horace Howard Furness Sr. and Jr. were Shakespeare scholars from Pennsylvania who devoted their lives to producing variorum editions of Shakespeare. A variorum is a work that collates all known variants of a text. Horace Howard Furness Sr. supervised Emily Folger's studies, which led to her master's degree in 1896, a year when only 250 women in the country received master's degrees. Here, Senior is showing his grandson how the ear trumpet works. Somebody tracked me down due to this photo and asked me whether I would authorize him to use the photo because ear trumpets are his specialty. I could only refer him to the archive where I obtained the photo University of Pennsylvania Rare Book and Manuscript Library in Philadelphia. Have you ever seen a letter handwritten by Emily Folger? 24 Brevoort Place, Brooklyn, New York, April 20, 1908. Dear Dr. Furness, all the way on the train from Wallingford to New York, I had a little bee in my bonnet. I have to let it out. I cannot express what I wish to say. Please divine it. Most affectionately yours, Henry and Emily C. Folger. But you may notice that Henry Ann is crossed out. I admit, I don't know what to make of this letter. This is a job for the docents, of course. Look at the 4 letters in the monogram at the top. E, C, J, F, Emily, Clara, Jordan, Folger. Both Henry and Emily attended every Vassar and Amherst reunions they could. Here they are among Amherst classmates at the 45th. In 1924, the class of 1879 received the cup for best attendance. Henry helped to pay for this silver cup. Henry and Emily, around 1930. The picture was not taken of them as a couple. I cheated. My daughter photoshopped it for my business card. I took this picture of Emily when she was in Glen Cove while watching a 1934 home movie at the home of the Folger grandniece I mentioned in Fredericksburg. This grandniece, who was named also Emily, is the same relative who donated Emily's Duchesse lace wedding gown to the Folger a few years ago. On February 8, 1936, Joseph Quincy Adams, director of the Folger, invited this man, Abraham Simon Wolfe Rosenbach, to deliver an address in the Elizabethan Theater of the library on any topic. Adams said, "You aided Mr. Folger more than did anyone else in assembling his great gift to the nation." Rosenbach did not lecture in the Folger until 1939, but returned in 1947 to give a second talk on this stage. Photo is from the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. This is one of my favorite photos. Henry Huntington in his rare book vault in the Huntington Library, San Marino, California. I devote a whole chapter in collecting Shakespeare to contrasting how the two Henrys had a gentlemanly rivalry, which I found very fascinating. Rosenbach adroitly played one off the other. In collecting Shakespeare, I write a thumbnail in the epilogue about each Folger director, but you do not see them. It's common to find people around here today who have known the last 3 Folger directors. This is why I introduce you today visually to the first 4. The first Folger director, William Adams Slade, that you see here, was a librarian and a poet. He was Mrs. Folger's choice to be the first director of the Folger, where he served from 1931 to 1934. He came from the Library of Congress and went back to the Library of Congress to head up its bibliographic division. In this photo I bought from the Library of Congress, Slate is pictured in the Folger director's office. The second director of the Folger, Joseph Quincy Adams, was a Shakespearean scholar and Shakespeare biographer. He was related to John Quincy Adams. He left Cornell to join the Folger in 1931 as director of research. He served as Folger director from 1934 until his death in 1946. I found this photo in the modern stacks at the Folger. The third director of the Folger, Louis B. Wright, was an historian and literary scholar. He served as Folger director from 1948 to 1968. I learned a lot from his two books, The Folger Library, 2 Decades of Growth, an Informed Account, and from Of Books and Men. He wrote, edited, or co-wrote 50 books and pamphlets. He kept an upstairs office at the Folger where he could more easily concentrate on his writing. Named one of the 9 best teachers in America by and on the cover of Time magazine in 1966, O.B. Hardison became the 4th director of the Folger in 1969 and stepped down in 1983. O.B. for Osborne Bennett presided over the major renovation of the Folger in 1977 to 1980, featuring the addition of the new reading room. The last 2 photos I obtained from the Wright and Hardison families directly. I met while doing research for the book. This picture is in the book, but I'm using it for reference. It took the Folgers 9 years to buy the 14 row houses and then demolish them to create the library work site. Did you know that many photos of the Library of Congress show the west end of Grant's Row? I never realized that. So picture that you are at the Capitol, looking east. Look at the color of Grant's Row on this postcard. It is red. The Sanborn period maps confirm that Grant's Row was made of red brick. Of course, there was no color photography back then. The way that the red was put on was either by crayons or colored pencils to form the tinted postcards of the period. This is going to be difficult to see, and I wanted to ask your indulgence in my showing this slide at the risk of interrupting the narrative flow. Why would I show another slide of almost the same scene, the Library of Congress from the top of the US Capitol? I bought this card at a recent postcard show in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Take note of the statue in the lower left. It really doesn't show. It's the controversial bare-chested statue, Horatio Greeno, carved in 1840 of our first president. Designed for the Capitol Rotunda, it was instead placed at the head of East Capitol Street, facing the Capitol. The postcard is postmarked in 1907. In 1908, the statue was brought to the Smithsonian Castle, and since 1964, is on the 2nd floor of the American History Museum, where I saw it. It's a statue, the only statue of bare-chested George Washington. George's right index finger is pointed toward the heavens, but some people thought he was signaling his valet to bring him a shirt. A 1931 photo of the library nearing completion. Note the scaffolding still covering the last Shakespeare friezes on the north facade. And today, in 2018, scaffolding is back on the facade. The Tuscan stone masons who carved the 9 friezes were the same ones who carved the seated Lincoln designed by Daniel Chester French for the Lincoln Memorial under the same general contractor, James Baird. What is the car parked outside Puck's Circle? It has one centered front headlight. Some antique car experts I consulted in Maine said it looks like a Packard Roadster sedan from the late 1920s. Whose is it? Perhaps some docents will help me find out. I loved the undated message written on the back of this card that I bought at an antiquarian postcard sale. Quote, "I did not know we had anything as perfect in this country as this library. It comforted me from the House of Representatives, which I found awful." Photographed by William Ritase. 1 month before he died, Henry wrote this letter to Paul Philippe Cray. "We spent a very happy hour yesterday in Mr. Gregory's studio. I will confess, I have been much worried, fearing that he might not be equal to the task put upon him. But I was satisfied that you had, once more, made a successful choice in your assistant. I tried not to show too plainly that I was pleased with the work, and of course said little or nothing on the subject to Mr. Gregory, preferring, as I do in all cases, that what I should say reach him with your approval and through you as a medium rather than direct. So I am now writing you, instead of communicating either by word of mouth or by letter with him, and will leave it to your judgment what you will pass on to him as coming from me." I found no image of John Gregory working on the Shakespeare friezes or on the Folger bust in the Great Hall. I did find in the Smithsonian Institution Archives of American Art this out-of-focus portrait of the young Gregory. In it, the British-born sculptor is in work garb contemplating panels he designed for the Huntington Mausoleum, which I've seen in San Marino, California. When this aerial photo was taken on May 1st, 1932, 1 week after the dedication of the Folger, look how the library defined the eastern footprint of Capitol Hill. The pilot took off from Hoover Airport, now National, and captured the pristine marble monument for all time. The Supreme Court was a work site. The cornerstone of the U.S. Supreme Court was laid in October 1932. The building was completed in 1935. The Adams Building of the Library of Congress, originally called the Annex, was opened to the public on January 3rd, 1939. Look how few buildings populate the mall. This is a close-up of the previous aerial photo. I obtained these photos from the Library of Congress. I wanted you to be aware of my website, Docents, as it contains information on the Folgers, as well as on my other books, book trailers, blogs, links, and book talks. I don't have my own blog, but I was invited to blog on my publisher's website and on bloggingshakespeare.com at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon. You'll find 27 blogs, among them one on the epic competition between Henry Folger and George A. Plimpton to secure Queen Elizabeth's corset. One on Emily Folger's play diary, and one on the 10 sites that Folger considered to locate his Shakespeare collection before choosing Washington, D.C. Henry Folger ordered 2 black racing umbrellas from an old company founded in London, Brigg and Sons. Emily's black umbrella handle is labeled at its base sterling silver. On Henry's umbrella, the initials HCF Jr. are monogrammed on a 1-inch high gold collar ring affixed under the handle. The junior in the gold monogrammed initials indicates that the umbrella was ordered while Henry Folger Sr. was still alive. On the latter's death in 1914, his son stopped writing Junior after his name. Between the collar ring and the top of the curved handle is a gold-capped brown pencil that fits into the crook of the handle. A 14-karat gold hallmark cap pivots for easy extraction and replacement so as to be flush with the handle. These are the 2 from the Folgers. The first one was on the website of the umbrella manufacturer. I got a telephone call one day from Chris Wright, whose father was the 3rd director of the Folger, Louis B. Wright. And Chris said, "Steve, we still have the 2 Folger umbrellas here that my father must have brought home someday. Would you like to take them back to the Folger?" Would I like to? So I went back, picked up the umbrellas, took a metro, putting both umbrellas on my lap, looking around to see whether somebody might say, "Oh, those are absolutely collector's items." Or, "Why would anyone be carrying 2 umbrellas?" Normally, one might use the concealed pencil on the racing umbrella to follow a filly's time around the track in Ascot. However, antiquarian book collectors with 0 interest in horse racing might use the pencil to jot down the title of a book they were tracking or the name of a bookseller to contact. It's highly likely that in the winter of 1918, when the Folgers were delayed in their train connections at Union Station during inclement weather, they opened these very umbrellas. Sheltered from the rain, they walked with determined gait up to East Capitol Street on a mission to identify a site on which to build a library for their Shakespeare collection. The notes Henry made on his map of Capitol Hill attached to his February 1918 letter to real estate agent McCreary were indeed written in pencil. Let's think about Henry Folger, the writer. We were cheated because he never wrote the book he said he'd like to, entitled Adventures and Misadventures of Book Collecting. But we do have hundreds of letters from him. Let's ponder 2 of them, written 54 years apart. Amherst, January 30, 1876. My dear father, As I have already written to Mother, there is very little left to say to you. But I wish to send an acknowledgement of the money I received. Many thanks for, and that, there you have a burn hole. I paid my bill yesterday and enclosed the receipt. Your letter reached me yesterday. Your letter reached me the day after I had followed your advice in regard to candy. Thursday, day of prayer for college, was observed here as a holiday. During the AM, we popped corn. In the afternoon, we went to church, and after supper, someone proposed that we try to make some candy. An experiment we have wanted to try ever since we came up here. George has a pail that holds about, and that is the end of page 1. In Henry's scorched letter to his father, he admits initial ineptness in drying his belongings on a wood stove to save money. He wrote his mother about college activities, his father about college finances. I find this letter to Herbert Putnam from Henry Folger amazing. It comes from Henry's pen the last year of his life. For the reticent, shy man who rarely bared his inner thoughts, it includes a singular expression of concern regarding his own legacy. January 3rd, 1930. Dear Mr. Putnam, as soon as I saw the notice of the volume honoring you in connection with the Congressional Library, I secured a copy and have read it with much pleasure. I was especially interested in the article on Benjamin Franklin by Jusserand. Benjamin Franklin's mother was a Folger. I've been wondering a great deal whether I will ever be able to get a 550-page volume published in my honor. The ever was added by hand, indicating that Folger reread his letters. It certainly shows that you have led a very kindly and a very helpful life. Yours very truly, H.C. Folger. Sent to the Library of Congress, reproduced from the collection in the manuscript division of the library. My book, Collecting Shakespeare, is 245 pages long. The Millionaire and the Bard by Andrea Mays is 350 pages. Together, that makes over 550 pages. It took 3/4 of a century after the Folger was dedicated until these biographies were published. My publisher asked for an author headshot for the book jacket. Instead, I sent them a wall shot. It was the last photo architectural photographer Robert Lautman took before he died at age 85. I'm standing between my two subjects. A few feet behind me are 2 urns with the Folger's ashes. Above me is Will with his quill in hand. Henry and Emily loved each other. They both loved Will. And it's the greatest ménage à trois in literary history. Thank you very much. Before launching into some dulcet questions, I have 2 honest presentations to make to Kate and to Nicole for having organized this talk. These are copies of a handwritten Folger family tree made in 1866 by Walter Folger on Nantucket Island. And this family tree was purchased by the New England Historic and Genealogical Society in Boston in 2009, and is proudly displayed on the 3rd floor of the administrative wing. So thank you, and please come up and get your diplomas. First question or comment?
What is a lepidoptera, please?
I don't see any in the hall. Lepidoptera is a collection of butterflies. So, this was the wife of a woman who loved butterflies. And Henry Folger, being someone who was always looking for Shakespeare treasures, was reading auction catalogs all the time. If you go into the vault beneath us, you will find 267 linear feet of auction catalogs that the Folger saved. That's 2/3 of a football field. They spent so much time going through the catalogs. So when you're going through a book catalog, an auction catalog, you don't look only for your specialty. If you have friends, you're looking for something. So he would look for golf books. He would look for books on Nantucket. He would look for anything on butterflies. And some of those butterfly books are very rare. They go back to the 1500s. So much for Lepidoptera. Yes.
Apologies to the non-docents in the crowd. We'll probably be asking tiny little detailed questions because we have to get it right. But I'm curious, you said something about Tuscan stone carvers that did the bas-reliefs. Yeah. You said something about Tuscan stone carvers that
Right.
did the bas-reliefs and the Lincoln statue. So Gregory didn't do them, is what you're saying. Gregory did not actually.
He designed them,
Okay, I always
but
thought.
he was not out there with his hammer, no.
Oh, okay, I never knew that.
Yeah,
That's
well,
good.
yeah, that's how they made it. So you have Daniel Chester French designed the seated Lincoln, but he was not doing the work.
Yeah, okay.
Rebecca's trying to find the microphone. Should I get it?
I heard you.
I'm probably sitting there. So for the friezes, it was an Italian company, and you can find it in the Collecting Shakespeare book. Can I remember it? Begins with P. I think it's a Pizzarelli. Pizzarelli, I guess it is. And I could only identify 2 of the workmen. But Chris Wright, the son of the 3rd director of the Folger, has kept in touch with a 3rd member of that group of craftsmen. Now that would be another book. That's why I hope some docent someday will say, hey, if you are a docent at the Folger, for those non-docents, I believe this is correct. You go, if you put in 1,000 hours of work as a docent, you have the right to go into the library and to use the library sources and services. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
One comment and one question. I was interested to see the portraits by Salisbury. Salisbury also did the portrait of Franklin Roosevelt, which is up at Hyde Park, and also the portrait of Truman, which is in the White House right now. The other question I had, or just question, is: do you have any idea who was the architect for their North Shore, Long Island house? It wasn't Harry Lindbergh, was it? Do you remember? Did you know?
I'm sorry, I just couldn't hear it. Who was the architect?
Who is the architect that did their house on Long Island?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that.
You don't know.
But I am in touch with the mistress of the house currently, and I'd be happy to ask her. She might know.
It looked very much like a Harry Lindbergh who designed in those
Right.
days many of those kind of houses, and I would
Yeah.
be very interested in knowing.
Yeah, thank you.
I think you've spoken in your book about serendipity. The Folgers came here and they wanted, their train was delayed in going to West Office Springs to Homestead. And so they wandered over here and they decided this would be a good place for their library.
That's pretty much what happened as far as we know. That's certainly part of the legend. But but they spent enough time so that Henry drew a map and had 4 locations. One of them, I believe, was the Supreme Court, because that was built later, but you couldn't have that. That was always going to be saved for a government building. And I think another one might have been what's now the Madison building of the Library of Congress. But they were all in this area. Before zeroing in on Washington, he had considered Nantucket Island for his library. Can you imagine? Let's get on the ferry and go over to look at some of the books in the library. He also considered Amherst College. He considered Chicago. He considered New York. The real estate prices in New York scared him, and he was always a businessman. But the low real estate prices in Nantucket didn't attract him because he just said it wouldn't be practical. But I found a list, penciled list of 10 sites that were written in alphabetical order. And I do put that in the book.
I'm curious as to the reception that you received in your trip a year ago to the British Isles. What Folger did to collect Shakespeare and bring it here. Did you find anything interesting about people who might have done similar work as you have done on collectors of Shakespeare in the British Isles?
I had expected to get a number of comments such as, we really miss having in our country what the Folgers bought and you have in your country. I did not get many of those comments. Everywhere I went, and I talked in universities, I talked in cultural centers, and I talked in a music hall, they all had some people who had visited the Folger because they know that it's the place to go to. So I did not sense any historical recriminations, but I might have.
A comment and then a question. We have heard you speak numerous times about your book, and once about 4 years ago, or 3 years ago, we heard you speak about pictures that never made it into the book. And each time we hear you speak, we learn more. And every presentation is different, but we don't know how you do it. It's delightful, thank you. And the question is, what about your hat? Did you introduce your hat today?
When I was asked to speak on Henry Folger at the Homestead, I got this crazy idea that I might want to try to dress as Henry. I could never be mistaken from him. He was 5'4", I'm 6'4". But I did communicate with people in the theater and communications part of the Folger, and they gave me names of some costume companies to write to. So I obtained this white bowler, very similar to the one that Folger played golf in. I also obtained a white beard, which Abigail and I carefully made a little bit darker with some ashes. But I find it very hard to speak through a cumbersome cotton beard. So that's the story. And you may have noticed that I put this bowler on the bed in the Shakespeare, I'm sorry, the Shakespeare, in the Folger bedroom at the house.
Is it a golfing bowler?
That's what I want you to think it is. Last question, yes.
Did the Folger family know their competitors, the Huntington family?
Did the Folgers know their competitors, the Huntington family? The Folgers and the Huntingtons both lived in New York for quite a while before Henry Huntington went out to the West Coast. They were members of the same club called the Hobby Club. The Hobby Club met maybe once every 6 months, and there would be a show and tell at some person's house of their collection. There was also a very extravagant meal and a menu written up in great calligraphy that all of the members would sign. And I have seen one or two of these menus where they both signed it. They were not close friends. They were certainly acquaintances, but they were very much after the same material. They had different canons. Huntington wanted every book to be pristine. He didn't want any marks. He was very interested in the bindings. Folger was not very interested in the bindings. He was very happy with fragments. He didn't need to have a whole book. And au contraire, he loved the books that were not pristine, because that's where you find the marginalia, the things that are written in the margins by the readers over the centuries. So that's why I always found it interesting to compare the two. One last thing about that is that Folger was a little bit later in planning his library than Huntington was. So Folger wrote Huntington, and I've seen the letter, and he said, I won't be able to come and see your library, I don't think, on the West Coast, but I would love for you to give me some pointers, because I'm not sure exactly what kind of foundation or institution I want to put together. So that was very interesting to see. And when the first manual for Folger's staff was put together of how to run a library, Folger had put, I think, 21 rules for letting books out and for the staff to work with readers coming in. And this was 2 items more than were in the Huntington Library Manual. Thank you very much for coming today.
Oh, yeah.